Hello, guys, and welcome to the first one of our summer series videos for this summer. And naturally, and as is already a tradition, we're gonna start with looking back at the prospect draft we've had 6 years ago, which means we go back to 2017 to look how we did in our prospect draft back then. And without further ado, we'll go straight to look at the list. I'll put the link in the description to the spreadsheet where you can browse through all this table and look how you did and how your prospects did. The stats here are up to the current season including, and also you can see where different prospects now play and so on. And most drafts will be known as the draft of the top selection, but I would say that this draft should be known as the Kale McCarr draft because it's the best player that came out of the draft. So, spoiler for the top 10 best picks. But also for our league, it was the first draft where we had Kevin, and nothing was ever the same. uh, Jokes aside, yeah, with this year was the one that we had an influx of new owners, but we'll talk more about this in the next video, which focuses on the season and not the draft itself. So moving on to the lists. First, we look at the top 10 best players from the draft based on their current NHL stats. And I've I will review this in tiers, and the top tier is only Kale McCarr. I think the only thing we need to discuss or remind ourselves is what did Clint get to trade McCarr away? Because I didn't remember actually that it was the Mighty Camels who drafted McCarr in the first place. So I'm curious to see. It must have been some big trade. And in the next year, we have Peterson and Robertson here. I think these two are pretty close. I've ranked Peterson as second because of his higher totals that he has achieved throughout his career, but I think Robertson and his more goal scoring acumen is pretty close, and maybe in a couple of years they can be flipped. In the next year, we have five guys, which I think are pretty close, but I've ranked Heiskanen in the first since he's a defenseman and a very solid one. And then Hischier, Suzuki, pretty close stat wise. And also, same can be said for sorry, Oettinger and Jarry. Uh, but mm, Oettinger has slightly better ratios. And look at the aces here. They almost pulled out the grand slam that the Dallas Stars did. Imagine if Mike also got Robertson and had the three Dallas Stars from this on this draft all on his team. Then we could also make jokes for his team similar to the Lux Royals team, and maybe it will be the Brooklyn Stars for Mike. He even has a star already in his logo, so that would be an easy switch. And in the bottom part of the top 10 are two players who are also not no slouches, but a little bit below the above in Martin Hs and Josh Norris. And in Norris, he has very good ratios in terms of per games played, but he has struggled to stay healthy. And if he plays more full seasons, I think he can climb up this list. The next top 10 are the best value picks, which means that picks that have been in the third round or below, basically very good late round picks. And the top tier here includes these three players, and I've ranked Taves in the top First because he's a defenseman, and second because he was a very late pick in the fifth round, the 89th overall. So a very really solid selection by Cam. And if you needed to be reminded, the green names here mean that these players are still with the team, and the black names means that the player is no longer with the team that is shown here as the drafting team. So basically means that Troy Terry is no longer with the Wanderers. Uh, and Terry and Thomas are also very good players, and these are players who are on the same tier, I would say, with the last two players of the previous top 10. So basically with Nechas and Josh Norris. Very, very solid players and very good picks, especially Taves in the fifth round. Magnificent selection, I would say. And the next three here again, the next tier in this list is Cirelli and two goaltenders. One is pretty established already, although playing in Philly would hurt his numbers over the next seasons, like similar to John Gibson in Anaheim. And the ranking of WoW here is a bit speculative since he only has played 11 games with excellent ratios, but I think being in Toronto should give him an opportunity since their goaltending picture isn't very clear, especially long term. So he could really establish himself and be even become an even better pick for Will going down the road. And in the bottom half of this top 10 are players who are pretty good and serviceable, but not really amazing. And they have been ranked basically the later the pick, the higher the rank because it's more value for the owners. And you see here three picks for the Solar Bears, and we'll come back to this later as this was a big draft and big in terms of quantity of players gotten, but only lacking a bit in top end quality apart from Thomas, I would say. So the next top 10 is the busts, and here we have. I would first stop and talk about the first one. So this pick from the Ramparts back then, the fifth overall selection of Shipachov, turned out obviously to be a lost pick. But not only this, it was, I think, this pick that made us rethink or change our rules in terms of draft age, adding draft age eligibility. So we restricted the draft age to 26 or below, mainly because of this selection, because it was like Shipachov was 30 years old. Next here on the list is Nolan Patrick, which most of you might have expected to be the top in this list. But the sad story about the Patrick is known for everyone that he's basically been ruined by injuries, which is always unfortunate to see with a prospect. And I got Patrick selected in another league as a top overall selection because I wasn't very sold on his year, and I know how probably Max has felt throughout the development or the misdevelopment of Patrick. So it's a pretty sad story. Next two players on this list, Vesalainen was impressive for me that from looking at stats from all seasons up to now, since the start of the league, he's among the top five least productive forwards that have played at least 40 games and are not bangers. So they're not on the ice to get penalty minutes or hits. He's supposed to be an offensive forward, but he's been in his 70 games so unproductive that he's among the top five least productive forwards to have played that many games, which is, I think, impressive. And Wodnia, from what I found, he not only hasn't played an NHL game, but he hasn't played any hockey in the last 2 years. So basically, he's done as a hockey player, not only as an NHL player, which is rare. rather rare for players that young and that highly thought of at the time of the draft. And the next six players are on players who are most of them are NHL relevant, at least not lived up to their hype or their expectations, but still had some decent runs here or there. And for Timmins, he's the only player here on this list who is still owned by his drafting franchise in the Jackalopes. So he might still develop for Max, probably in Toronto now. We'll see. Next, we'll look at some overall stats about the draft. And before that, I forgot to mention when we talked about Tristan Jarry in the top 10 selections that Jarry was actually, or is, from what I have seen until now, he might be considered the most prominent player who has been drafted twice in our league, because this selection in 2017 by Jay of Jarry was actually the second time he was drafted, and the first time he was drafted in 2013 by Tim and Nick in the Montreal team. So the trivia here, when we look at why we look at the stats, you can make a guess. How many players have been drafted twice? This includes not only in 2017 or up to 2017, but up to this draft that we had now in 2023. How many players have been drafted twice? Also, hint, we have not had a player who has been drafted three times, so only once or twice. So these are how many have been drafted twice. So while you make your guesses, we look at some stats or charts about the draft in 2017. The number of NHLers were pretty much on par with what we've had, around 60% or 60 out of the 100 became or are in the NHL now. The interesting part was that compared to previous classes, a lot more of these players from the 2017 class have moved over to play in Europe compared to staying in the minors, in the North American minors. And some players are in some other lower leagues, mostly again in Europe. An interesting fact is that JC Boudin, who was a selection in the fifth round by the Wanderers, is now actually playing for the Wolfsburg Grizzlies, which is James's real life team. So this is an interesting tidbit. So moving on, about the age was pretty poor in this draft in terms that on one side we drafted a lot younger, so maybe because we had drained a little bit of the pool of the already drafted players over the previous the previous drafts. So basically, a lot more than 50 of the selections were from the current draft, so the 2017 NHL draft. But also on the other end of the spectrum, we had quite a few more older, like you see in the 22, 3, and 5, and 27 plus ages. We have had in 2017 higher than the average number of players picked in 2017, and we'll we'll see who actually contributed to that. And this is a chart which I am introducing for the first time. I don't know if it's easy to read, but basically I've extracted the data and tried to rank every prospect from the drafts we've already revisited and rank it in tiers. Like you see here, the bright green is a stud, so basically, of course, your Connor McDavids are here, but not only. Basically, every player who hovers around or slightly below point per game will be here. And I didn't want to make a superstar tier where only basically McDavid and Matthews and Makar will be. So they're lumped with other studs. Good players are ones who are like basically second liners. Average players are still players who are worth rostering in most nights, And fringe are players have been in the NHL most of the time, but are fringe in terms of their fantasy worthiness. And non-NHL is non-NHL. So that was the easy. So basically, what you see should represent the deeper the green goes, the deeper the draft. And the bigger the bright greens, it means that the draft is top heavy. So you see that 2015 was both top heavy and deep, which is no surprise. Uh, and also 2013 seems to be a lot top heavy. 2017 was really not very star-studded, or the draft we're looking at compared to the previous drafts. It didn't provide a lot of players. This, by the way, is percentages. So for most drafts up to now, it's also number of players because we had 100 selections in each of the drafts, apart from the 2012, which had 200. But all the other drafts have had 100 selections, so this is also percentage and also number of players. But it will change once we get into the sixth round drafts. Anyway, uh, I think these are interesting stats. If someone is more interested in looking deeper into these, I can also send you the data behind this. But it's, I think, an interesting. Maybe Brad, who has more inside knowledge of scouting in terms of doing this professionally, could could say if he feels like, for example, the 2015 and 2013 drafts have been deeper than the other uh, ones. And also keep in mind that these are the UDL drafts, which is not one-to-one to the NHL drafts. So yeah, it's a quite a tangent here about this graph, but I think it was interesting to look at and maybe compare. And back to our trivia question, uh, and the answer is 24. Let me know in in the chat, league chat, if someone guessed right or if it was, or if you were close. And of these 24 players, four of them have been drafted twice by the same teams. So you can, the owners of these players can also can maybe come out and share, and see if we get all four on the chat. Okay, moving on. Moving on to the table of how well did each team do. And again, these are the, so to say, roto standings that I do to rank how each team draft based on some parameters. And you see here that a handful of teams did pretty well, like maybe you can say that up to the scouts, all of these teams had good drafts, although the scouts have no remaining players on their roster since from this draft. And here are the players. The greens means that it's still a farm player, so not signed to an entry level, and the black means that they have already signed. And we have here a couple of asterisks. So that Wall was actually traded by the Bears and then reacquired, and Montembeau for the Wanderers is now a FA pickup. So they have dropped him a long time ago, and he's just back now with his drafting team because they picked him up this season as a free agent. So he's not like being actually drafted and developed along the normal contract path. And so we talked about most of the prospects about the top three teams, but I would like to focus on the Solar Bears. This was also Will's first draft, not only Kevin's. And this was quite a draft in terms of players. And it's interesting how it started out for Will a little bit so-so, then it dropped off with Lint and Pooh, but then he finished out quite strong with his final four selections all have either become or trending to become solid NHL players, which is quite good. And you see that 7 of his 9 picks became NHL regulars, which is quite impressive. And on the other end, we had two teams that have had impressively bad drafts in the Steelers and the Warriors. To be fair to both teams, they none of them had any picks before the fourth round, so they not only had a few picks, but also it was late. For the Warriors, impressively, they are the only teams on from that still own both their players, all their players, which in this case are only two, but they still own 100% of the players that they took in this draft 6 years ago, and these are Toropchenko and Michael DiPietro. So not great stars, but still with the team. And about the Steelers, this was my draft class, all in the fourth round. And apart from Paling, who got 15% of his NHL goals in his first NHL game and then didn't score a lot after that. Yeah, nothing to show. And Tyler Parsons is actually the only player who is officially listed as retired from this draft class. I don't know what happened to him, uh, or if he retired for some injury or was just not doing well professionally and decided to quit pursuing his professional career. And one more thing, and not less important to focus on, the Ramparts, which were in under then owner Fabrice, were in their win now mode. They drafted. I would think I haven't checked it, but I would be willing to bet that this is the oldest draft class we have ever seen and likely to ever see, with 25.7 average age of the players that they took. As I said already about Shipachyov, he's the likely reason that we restricted the draft age to 26, but he took three players that would not be eligible to be drafted now in Deo and OV2. So this is like a picture of a Rampart prospect now. So he's there. They would be so old now. But basically, it was an interesting strategy by then owner Fabrice to draft only players that would jump into the lineup immediately, even though most of them had really no upside, maybe apart from Shipachyov. Anyway, thank you. That was all. Thanks for watching. And next week or around this time next week, I think we'll look at the 2017-18 season and what happened then, who did well, what trades we had, and so on. Until then, keep enjoying your summer and enjoying the Pugdoku, and I'll see you around. Bye bye.